Mohan Singh, Soldier of Freedom, Voice of a Nation. Part 1. Roots of Rebellion. The Early Life of Mohan Singh. In the pale dawn of January 3, 1909, the frost still clinging to the wild mustard flowers of Punjab, a child was born into the tangled heart of empire. In Badiana, a small village near Sialkot, a land now divided by borders, but then just part of the living, breathing soil of undivided India, Mohan Singh took his first breath. His arrival was a whisper in the wind, unnoticed by the world, yet destined to echo through the annals of a nation's struggle for freedom. Mohan's family, the Gumanjat Sikhs, had tilled the land of Punjab for generations. They were farmers with calloused hands and proud hearts, their daily lives entwined with the rhythm of harvest and prayer. His father, Tara Singh, was a man of quiet resolve, while his mother, Hukam Kaur, was a woman forged in the crucible of hardship, a spirit as enduring as the fields she called home. But fate, with its inscrutable logic, dealt Mohan a cruel blow before he could even see his father's face. Tara Singh died 2 months before Mohan's birth, leaving behind a widow heavy with grief and a child destined to be marked by absence. The tragedy of this loss would ripple through Mohan's life, shaping not only the contours of his childhood but the very substance of his soul. With her heart shattered but her will unbroken, Hukam Kaur returned to her parental home in Badiana. There, in the shelter of her own kin, she would raise her only son amid a chorus of aunts and cousins, elders and infants, a village within a village, held together by love, custom, and the fierce necessity of survival. Mohan grew up in a world where women carried burdens both visible and invisible, their stories woven into the lullabies that soothed him to sleep. In that matriarchal refuge, Mohan was a child of longing and restless energy. He listened, wide-eyed, as his grandmother recounted the legends of the Sikh gurus, of heroes who rode into battle with the flame of faith in their hearts and the steel of resolve in their hands. Stories of resistance, of martyrs and miracles, mingled with the very air he breathed. The tales of Banda Singh Bahadur and Maharaja Ranjit Singh, of Akali warriors and colonial uprisings, were as real to him as the distant thunder of British boots on Indian soil. But it was not just myth and memory that shaped Mohan Singh. The shadow of the Raj stretched across Punjab, casting long lines of injustice and indignity. The wounds of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre were fresh, bleeding through the whispered conversations of adults in the night. The Ghadar movement's exiles, once farmers and shopkeepers, had become legends in their absence, their names spoken with a mix of reverence and fear. Even as a small boy, Mohan absorbed the bitterness and hope of those around him. He saw his uncles, proud Sikhs, bristle at the casual humiliations of colonial officials. He saw his mother's eyes darken at stories of land taxes and forced labor. The questions began to swirl in his mind, stubborn and insistent. Why did his people so strong, so honorable bow to foreign masters? Why must the sons of Punjab serve an alien king? Education, in such times, was both a privilege and a weapon. Mohan's family, though humble, recognized the spark in his eyes, the sharpness with which he questioned, the eagerness with which he learned. Against the backdrop of rural poverty, they pooled what little they had to send him to the local school. There, among the dust and chalk, Mohan distinguished himself as a student quick to learn, quicker to ask the questions others were too timid to utter. Teachers noted his natural leadership. He was not content to recite lessons by rote. He wanted to know why things were as they were, why history bent under the weight of empire. He helped classmates with their work, organized games, mediated disputes. The weight of his father's absence was always there, a silent gravity, but it did not bow his shoulders. Instead, it seemed to steel his resolve, as if the gap in his life must be filled by purpose. Yet, for all his intellect and spirit, Mohan's future did not point toward the cloistered world of scholarship or the turbulence of the political maiden. Instead, it followed the time-honored path of his people, the army. For young men of Punjab, especially those of the Sikh tradition, soldiering was not just a career, but a calling. The British Indian Army offered adventure, respect, and a chance to escape the grinding wheel of rural life. When Mohan completed his secondary schooling, the decision was made one born of both necessity and a lingering romantic sense of duty. At 18, in the uncertain spring of 1927, he enlisted in the 14th Punjab Regiment. He left behind the fields of his childhood and the embrace of his mother for the regimental barracks of Firozpur. The journey was both thrilling and disorienting. Here, the rhythms of the village were replaced by the drumbeat of discipline, the songs of freedom by the shouts of foreign officers. Mohan's adaptability quickly set him apart. In the crucible of basic training, he showed not only endurance and strength but an uncanny ability to lead and inspire. British superiors, always wary of promoting Indians too quickly, could not ignore his talent. Soon, he was singled out for officer training, a rare honor, reserved for those whom the Empire believed could serve its interests. At Kitchener College in Nowgong and later at the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun, Mohan Singh was schooled in the ways of the imperial officer, saluting the Union Jack, mastering tactics, learning the rules of a world that was not quite his own. Yet, beneath the polished boots and pressed uniforms, the seeds of disquiet grew. He learned what it meant to serve a power that did not trust him, to be both an insider and an outsider. On February 1, 1935, Mohan Singh received his commission as an officer, a moment of pride not just for him, but for the family and community who had sacrificed so much to see him rise. He was posted first to the Border Regiment, then, in early 1936, to the Honest Battalion, 14th Punjab Regiment at Jhelum. In the eyes of the British, he was a loyal servant. In the eyes of his people, a rising hope. Yet, even as he donned the king's colors, Mohan Singh remained haunted by the voices of his childhood, the stories of loss, longing, and the ceaseless call to justice. He had become a man straddling two worlds, the proud son of Punjab and the dutiful officer of empire, his destiny suspended between obedience and rebellion, between memory and the promise of a day when his country might stand free in the sunlight of its own making. Part 2. Marching Toward Destiny. Mohan Singh's early military career. The starched uniform of the British Indian Army hung crisply on Mohan Singh's broadening shoulders, the silver insignia of a lieutenant gleaming against its deep khaki. He looked every inch the officer, his posture straight, his turban immaculate, his bearing calm and precise. But beneath the outward symbols of authority, a quiet storm gathered, a gathering sense of contradiction and unrest that would shape the next chapter of his life. When Mohan Singh arrived at his new posting with the Honest Battalion, 14th Punjab Regiment in Jhelum in 1936, he found himself in an institution that was at once familiar and profoundly alien. The rhythms of army life, morning drills, meticulous inspections, and the measured camaraderie of the officers' mess offered structure and purpose. Yet, the shadow of the Raj hung heavy over every parade ground, every mess hall conversation, every interaction between British and Indian officers. The British, despite their proclamations of equality and shared sacrifice, kept their Indian subordinates at arm's length, a subtle barrier of condescension never quite breached. For most young men from villages like Badiana, the army was a means of survival and aspiration, a ticket out of poverty, a way to earn a name and a pension. Mohan saw it as something more, a forge in which his character would be tempered, a crucible for discipline and resolve. He was diligent and ambitious, but also, in a way that set him apart, deeply observant. He paid attention not only to tactics and logistics but to the nuances of power and the undertones of resistance. His superiors, both Indian and British, quickly came to respect his intellect and steady hand. Among the men he led recruits drawn from every corner of India. He became known for his fairness, his willingness to listen, and his capacity to inspire loyalty. The world beyond the regimental lines was changing. The late 1930s were years of gathering storms. Europe shuddered as fascism rose in Germany and Italy. Japan expanded across Asia, and, in India, the cry for self-rule grew louder with every passing month. The Congress Party's agitation was becoming more daring, and rumors of mutiny, dissent, and radical ideas floated like pollen on the Punjab wind. In mess halls and canteens, young Indian officers, many of them, like Mohan, from humble backgrounds, would whisper about Gandhi, Nehru, and Bose, about the possibility that one day the sons of India might turn their rifles against their masters. But discipline was the army's first commandment, and Mohan Singh wore it like a second skin. He was promoted to temporary captain as his battalion prepared for operational service beyond India's borders. His rapid rise was both a recognition of talent and a test of loyalty. The British needed Indian officers to hold the empire's distant outposts, but they watched for any hint of nationalist infection with hawk-like vigilance. For Mohan, every step upward in rank brought a greater sense of responsibility not just to his men, but to something larger and unnamed stirring in his heart. Amid the pressures of military life, there were still moments of joy, small oases of happiness that offered respite from the daily grind. In December 1940, Mohan married Jaswant Kaur, the sister of a fellow officer. The wedding, held in the rich tradition of Punjabi Sikh families, was a blaze of color and music in an uncertain world. For a while, the burdens of leadership were lightened by the warmth of partnership and the promise of a family. Jaswant became his confidant, her gentle wisdom a counterpoint to his driven nature. In the letters they exchanged, she urged him to keep faith with his values, even as the world grew darker. Then, in the early months of 1941, came an order that would change everything. The British, their attention fixed on the gathering threat of Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia, issued sudden commands. The Honest Battalion, 14th Punjab Regiment, was to leave for Malaya, a region then simmering with tension. For Mohan, it meant leaving behind family, friends, and the land he loved for a place of unimaginable challenge. As the regiment boarded ships in Bombay and sailed for the tropics, Mohan stood at the prow, his face set with resolve, knowing instinctively that the journey ahead would demand all the courage and adaptability he possessed. Malaya was another world, a crossroads of empire, a place where Indian laborers toiled in plantations, Chinese merchants bartered in bustling markets, and Malay sultans ruled in ornate palaces overshadowed by British officials. The jungles were dense, the heat relentless, the air thick with the sense of spice and fear. Here, Mohan threw himself into his work, building rapport with his men, learning to navigate not only the landscape but the tangled loyalties of the colonial outpost. He listened to the stories of Indian workers who dreamed of home, absorbing their grievances and hopes, and he came to understand how the chains of empire were forged not only in London or Delhi, but in the everyday humiliations of exile. The lull of routine was shattered on December 7, 1941, when news reached Malaya of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The world tilted on its axis. In a matter of weeks, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia with an energy that seemed almost unstoppable. British defenses crumbled in the face of surprise and superior tactics, and the Indian regiments, including Mohan's own, found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated. In the chaos of retreat, the bonds forged in training were tested as never before. The Battle of Jitra was a nightmare. Positions were overrun, command structures collapsed, and Mohan found himself shepherding a dwindling group of survivors through the malarial jungles, evading capture, tending to the wounded, surviving on hope and what little food they could scavenge. It was here, in the thick of defeat, that the lessons of his childhood resilience, sacrifice, loyalty rose in him like a tide. Days passed in confusion and exhaustion, and then, as fate would have it, Mohan and his men were surrounded and captured by the Japanese. Taken to Alor's Star, he was thrust into a new and bewildering reality, a prisoner, his future uncertain, his sense of duty in tatters. But destiny, it seemed, was not yet finished with him. In the makeshift offices of the Japanese Intelligence Corps, he was introduced to Major Fujiwara Iwaichi, an enigmatic Japanese officer, and Hyon-hui Singh, a leader of the Indian nationalist movement in exile. What followed was not the humiliation of a vanquished enemy, but the beginning of an extraordinary dialogue, a proposition that would force Mohan to the very edge of his conscience and set in motion events that would reverberate through the heart of India's struggle for freedom. Would he remain a servant of the British Empire, or would he seize the perilous, uncertain chance to forge a new army from the ashes of defeat, an army not for Britain, but for India? In the jungles of Malaya, at the crossroads of history and personal destiny, Mohan Singh stood on the brink. The answer he would give, drawn from the depths of loss, longing, and hope, would change not only his own fate, but the fate of a nation waiting, breathless, for the dawn. Part 3. In the Shadow of Empire, the birth of the Indian National Army. The walls of the improvised Japanese headquarters at Alor's Star were thin, but the decisions made there would thunder across continents. Mohan Singh, once a captain in the British Indian Army, sat at a battered table beneath the dim glow of a lantern, his wrists raw from weeks in captivity, his spirit bruised but unbroken. It was the spring of 1942. A season of shattered certainties and impossible choices. For days, Mohan had watched the faces of his men, haunted and hollow-eyed, as they shuffled through makeshift prison camps. Many were barely more than boys, the dust of Punjab and Bengal still on their boots, their loyalty to the British crown as battered as their bodies. They had been promised honor for their service, but in defeat, the Raj had abandoned them, left them to starve, fall ill, or simply vanish in the fever-soaked jungles of Malaya. To Mohan, this was the ultimate betrayal, a shattering of the silent contract that bound soldier to commander, and, in his heart, a turning point. When the Japanese summoned him, it was not as a defeated enemy, but as a man upon whose shoulders they now wished to drape a different mantle, that of a leader, a liberator, the potential architect of a new army born from the ruins of the old. Major Fujiwara Iwaichi, the Japanese chief of intelligence, was a study in contradictions, courteous yet calculating, an invader speaking the language of freedom. Alongside him stood Hyon-hui Singh, a Sikh nationalist whose own life had been spent in the long shadow of exile, his faith in India's destiny undimmed by distance. Fujiwara's proposal was at once audacious and seductive. Why not raise an army from among the Indian prisoners of war, an army that would not fight for the empire that had betrayed them, but for their own motherland? The Japanese promised respect and recognition, the chance to strike at the British from the east, and, perhaps, a real partnership in the coming struggle. Mohan listened, torn between suspicion and hope. He knew well the reputation of the Japanese, a nation as ruthless as it was disciplined, and understood that their embrace could be as deadly as their weapons. Yet, as he weighed the faces of his men and the weight of his own conscience, a vision began to take shape. An Indian force united not by compulsion, but by choice. Not mercenaries in a foreign war, but sons reclaiming their birthright. At first, the idea seemed impossibly fragile. Some prisoners scoffed at the notion, fearful of trading one master for another. Others, desperate for escape, clung to Mohan's every word, hungry for meaning amid despair. The Japanese, sensing the uncertainty, played a careful game, offering just enough autonomy to keep the hope alive, while keeping the levers of power within their reach. But Fujiwara made one gesture that changed everything. In an act both symbolic and practical, he placed the custody of tens of thousands of Indian prisoners, nearly 40,000 men, into Mohan Singh's hands. "They are yours," he said, "to lead as you see fit." In that moment, the impossible became reality. Mohan was no longer just a prisoner, but a general. With trembling resolve, he accepted the responsibility, knowing full well that the line between hero and traitor, between freedom fighter and collaborator, was as thin as the edge of a sword. Thus, in the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, the Indian National Army was born. Recruitment began in earnest, but it was not coercion that filled its ranks. It was the desperate, aching desire for dignity, for agency, for revenge against a power that had treated Indian lives as expendable. Men from every province, every faith, found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder, their differences blurred by hunger and hope. Mohan was relentless. He spent long nights moving from camp to camp, speaking to the men not as their superior, but as their brother. He told them of India's history, the valor of the Sikh gurus, the sacrifice of martyrs, the ancient promise that one day the land would be free. "We have a duty to our mothers and fathers, to the rivers and fields that gave us life," he would say, his voice thick with conviction. "Let no one call us traitors. We do not fight for Japan. We fight for Bharat Mata, for India herself." The INA, as it was soon called, became a crucible of transformation. Former clerks, farmers, teachers, and laborers were drilled into new formations. Training was improvisational, equipment scarce, discipline a daily challenge. Mohan insisted on one rule above all: the INA would never become a mere auxiliary for the Japanese. Its loyalty would be to India, not to Tokyo. And he made this clear in every negotiation, resisting any order that threatened the army's autonomy. The Japanese, for their part, were often confounded by Mohan's tenacity. Some officers, like Fujiwara, were content to play the role of benefactor, supporting the INA's symbolic value. Others saw it as a tool, a puppet force to distract the British. But Mohan would not be used, and this stubbornness became both his shield and his peril. News of the INA's formation swept through the Indian communities of Southeast Asia, electrifying exiles, merchants, and laborers. In distant Punjab and Bengal, rumors reached families who had given up hope stories that their sons, lost in Malaya, had become part of a new army marching for freedom. The INA's swelling numbers and Mohan Singh's growing stature drew the attention of the Indian Independence League, led by Rash Behari Bose, who offered political vision and organizational structure to the military endeavor. On September 1, 1942, the INA was formally established. The event was both celebration and oath-taking, an act of defiance against the empire that had ruled India for nearly 2 centuries. Mohan Singh was named Commander-in-Chief, his appointment confirmed by the League and the gathering leaders of the diaspora. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the tides of history had shifted a new force, Indian in name and spirit, now moved upon the chessboard of empire. But the path was never simple. Mohan knew that the INA's fate rested not just on the battlefield, but on its ability to remain true to its purpose. Each day, he faced new doubts, new temptations, new pressures to compromise. Yet in every action, every speech, he returned to the same refrain: "We are not mercenaries. We are sons of India." Even as the world war raged around him, even as alliances shifted and betrayals loomed, Mohan Singh clung to his vision: an army not of vengeance, but of liberation. He had stepped from the shadows of empire into the blinding light of history, a light that would, for a time, illuminate the hopes of millions. For a brief, shining moment, the INA stood as a testament to what Indians could become: soldiers of their own destiny, voices of their own nation. And at the heart of this revolution stood Mohan Singh, a man who, by choosing freedom over safety, had begun to remake not only his own life, but the very future of his people. Part 4. Soldiers of the Dream. The INA rises in the flames of war. The words spread like wildfire, carried on the breath of every prisoner, every exile, every Indian sojourner in the far-flung reaches of Southeast Asia. There was a new army in the jungle, and it bore not the Union Jack but the hope of a broken nation. The Indian National Army, Azad Hind Fauj, was no longer a whispered rumor. It had become a living force, pulsing with the ache of a million wounds and the courage that rises from despair. By the beginning of 1942, Mohan Singh, newly christened as general by men who had once only known him as a comrade in defeat, was now the leader of this impossible, fragile revolution. His every day began before dawn and ended long after nightfall, his mind a constant map of worry and resolve. Each morning, the humid Malayan air would shimmer with the shouts of drill instructors, their commands mixing with patriotic songs, lyrics hurriedly written, then shouted skyward with the kind of fervor that only comes from those with nothing left to lose. Recruits poured in from every quarter: farmers from Bihar, students from Calcutta, seasoned sepoys from Punjab. Some had been lured by rumor, others by the desperate need to reclaim their dignity after the defeat at Jitra and the fall of Singapore. Yet, for all their differences, language, caste, province, they were united by two things: hunger and the embers of a common dream. But it was not easy to shape that dream into something solid. These men were not volunteers in the usual sense. They had been prisoners, survivors, the discarded pawns of a crumbling empire. Some clung to old loyalties, wary of the Japanese, mistrustful even of their new leader. The wounds of surrender still burned. The specter of being branded traitor by their countrymen back home was real and terrifying. Mohan Singh knew this better than anyone. The ghosts of doubt were everywhere. At night, he would walk among the barracks, pausing to listen, to talk, to answer the questions that gnawed at his soldiers' sleep. What will happen to us if the British win? What if the Japanese betray us? Will our families forgive us? In every conversation, Mohan returned to the same truths: that India's freedom was a cause worth any sacrifice, that they were no longer tools of an empire but the architects of a new destiny. The INA's training grounds were both classroom and crucible. Mohan and his officers, themselves only recently released from captivity, became teachers as much as commanders. They held patriotic classes before the morning's drills, recounting the sagas of ancient Indian resistance, the words of Vivekananda and Tagore, the battles of the gurus, and the wisdom of the saints. Mohan insisted that every soldier, no matter how battered, must understand why he fought not for the Japanese, not for vengeance alone, but for India, for family, for honor. Discipline, too, was hard won. Supplies were meager, rations barely enough to stave off the hunger that gnawed at every stomach. The Japanese offered help, food, uniforms, even weapons, but their assistance came with unspoken strings. Officers like Fujiwara, who had once charmed with promises of independence, now pressed Mohan to march his men where Japanese needs were greatest. At every meeting, Mohan fought to keep the INA's purpose clear. "We are not your mercenaries," he would repeat, sometimes through clenched teeth. "Our only enemy is the British Raj." The challenges multiplied. Disease swept the camps: malaria, dysentery, the fevers that had haunted the jungles long before any army had marched there. Spirits flagged. Mohan sent his officers to comfort the sick, to carry water, to dig latrines with their own hands. Leadership, he knew, was forged not in the easy days, but in the moments when hope seemed about to break. Outside the camps, word of the INA's existence began to spark new fires. In the tea shops of Rangoon, the markets of Singapore, and the shrines of Penang, the Indian diaspora began to organize. The Indian Independence League, led by the tireless Rash Behari Bose, became a partner in the cause, its members sending supplies, smuggling messages home, rallying support among students, workers, and the sons and daughters of indentured laborers. For these exiles, far from the soil of their birth, the INA was a last, best chance to redeem their longing for a homeland lost to colonial chains. The Japanese, watching these developments, grew uneasy. Some officers admired Mohan Singh's independence. Others resented it, wishing to turn the INA into nothing more than an extension of their own army. Tensions flared. Promises made in the heat of alliance began to dissolve in the cold calculations of war. The Japanese High Command, growing impatient with Mohan's insistence on autonomy, issued orders that would have subordinated the INA to Japanese command. For Mohan, this was the line that could not be crossed. He refused. He argued, cajoled, threatened resignation. He could accept hardship, hunger, and even the possibility of failure, but he would not let the men who had trusted him become mere fodder for another empire's ambitions. The fight was for India, or it was nothing. It was a defiance too far. In December 1942, the Japanese struck. Mohan Singh was arrested, stripped of his command, and held under house arrest, a betrayal all the more bitter for its inevitability. The INA, suddenly leaderless, trembled on the edge of dissolution. But even as his cell door clanged shut, the dream Mohan Singh had awakened would not die. His officers struggled to hold the army together, drawing on the lessons and faith he had instilled. The Indian Independence League fought to keep the cause alive, and word of Mohan's stand spread among the troops. Their general had been punished not for cowardice, but for refusing to bow. In the months that followed, as Japanese fortunes waned and the tides of war began to turn, a new leader would step into the void. Subhas Chandra Bose, whose charisma and vision would carry the INA into the history books. But Mohan's contribution, his stubborn, principled refusal to betray his men or his nation, became legend. For those who survived, and for those who heard the story in later years, it was Mohan Singh's flame that first lit the path. The INA was never just an army. It was a dream, forged in defeat and kept alive by the sheer will of those who refused to surrender, not just to the British, not just to the Japanese, but to the slow erosion of hope itself. And so, even as Mohan Singh vanished for a time into the shadows, the torch he carried would pass to other hands, its light burning brighter for all that it had endured. Part 5. Captivity, Controversy, and the Continuing Struggle. In the twilight of 1942, Mohan Singh found himself in yet another cell, this one quieter, more isolated, but just as suffocating as any prison camp in the jungle. He had been removed from his command by the very power that, months before, had called him a hero and liberator. The Japanese, their patience frayed by his insistence on autonomy for the Indian National Army, now regarded him with suspicion. The man who had inspired thousands to take up the cause of freedom was silenced, left to pace the cold floor and battle a new adversary, doubt. It was a strange, bitter fate for Mohan Singh, whose every instinct since childhood had been to move forward, to resist, to lead. He had stepped out of the shadow of colonial subjugation only to find himself ensnared by the ambitions of another empire. He brooded on the choices he had made and the consequences they had unleashed. Had he been naive to trust the Japanese? Had he sacrificed too much his honor, his men's safety, his own soul for a cause whose success seemed always just out of reach? Beyond the walls of his confinement, the world convulsed with new violence. The tide of the war in the Pacific had begun to turn. Japanese victories stalled. Allied forces slowly, stubbornly clawed their way back through the islands and the dense, blood-soaked jungles of Southeast Asia. For the INA, bereft of its first leader, these were uncertain days. Morale faltered. Some soldiers deserted. Some surrendered to despair. But others, remembering the discipline and vision Mohan Singh had kindled, clung more fiercely to the dream of a free India. In June 1943, hope took a new form. Subhas Chandra Bose, the charismatic revolutionary who had electrified crowds in India and Europe alike, arrived in Southeast Asia. Bose, like Mohan Singh, was a man who believed in action, in the sanctity of sacrifice. But he was also a master of politics and rhetoric, a leader who could charm even the most hardened skeptic. Under his stewardship, the INA was reconstituted, reinvigorated. Its flag raised high in battle and in ceremony. Bose brought with him a new surge of energy and purpose. The Chalo Dilli campaign cry, "On to Delhi," became the rallying call for an army on the march. For Mohan Singh, these changes were bittersweet. The Japanese, perhaps fearing his independence or wishing to avoid internal conflict, kept him sidelined. He watched from the margins as the army he had founded became a new instrument of history. His name faded from newspapers, but not from the hearts of his men. Among the first volunteers of the INA, stories of Mohan Singh's courage and refusal to bow were whispered with reverence. They remembered how he had resisted not only the British, but the Japanese, how, when asked to betray the soul of the movement, he had chosen principle over expedience. As the war drew to a violent close, Mohan Singh's own story took a sharp, uncertain turn. With the defeat of Japan in 1945, Allied soldiers stormed back through Southeast Asia, liberating prisoner-of-war camps, rounding up collaborators, and reclaiming lost ground for the British Empire. For the members of the INA, men who had dared to rebel, the question of their fate hung in the balance. The British authorities, stung by the INA's defiance and shaken by the specter of mass dissent among their own Indian troops, responded with the full weight of law. Mohan Singh and his comrades were captured and brought back to India not as heroes, but as traitors. The stage was set for the Red Fort trials, a moment of reckoning not only for the accused, but for the entire nation. The trials, intended by the British to serve as a public warning, achieved precisely the opposite effect. Across India, outrage erupted. Crowds gathered outside courtrooms, students marched through city streets, workers went on strike, and mothers wept for sons accused of treason. The country had seen the INA's struggle not as a crime, but as a testament to India's yearning for self-rule. The phrase INA heroes entered the popular lexicon. Mohan Singh, who had once feared being forgotten, found himself at the very heart of a national awakening. The pressure mounted until the British were forced to yield. Rather than execution or long imprisonment, Mohan Singh and many of his fellow officers were cashiered, stripped of their military rank, dismissed from the army, but allowed to go free. For Mohan, it was a strange sort of victory. He had lost his career, but won his freedom, and, more importantly, seen the seeds he had sown flower into a movement too vast for any regime to crush. Yet the India to which he returned was itself in agony. The Second World War was over, but the subcontinent was on the verge of being torn apart by the violence of partition. In August 1947, independence came, trailing both the euphoria of liberation and the unspeakable sorrow of division. The Punjab, the land of Mohan Singh's ancestors, the village of Badiana, the city of Sialkot, was to be carved up, its people divided by an arbitrary line on a foreigner's map. Mohan Singh, like millions of Sikhs and Hindus, became a refugee. Forced to abandon his childhood home, he joined the endless caravans trudging east across the burning plains. The loss was almost unimaginable. Land, memories, heirlooms, friendships, everything that had anchored his sense of self, all left behind in the violence and chaos of partition. In the storm of migration, the proud general of the INA became one more exile among many, searching for safety and belonging in the new Republic of India. Yet, even now, Mohan Singh could not be content to sit idle. He was allotted land in Jujiana near Ludhiana, a small gesture by the government to compensate those displaced by the border's cruel logic, but restlessness gnawed at him. The fields of Punjab teemed with the displaced, the hungry, the broken. He saw, with the eye of both soldier and servant, that his new struggle would not be against empires, but against despair. He rallied the remnants of the INA, calling upon their discipline and loyalty once again, not for war, but for healing. As refugees poured into East Punjab, Mohan Singh and his old comrades became protectors, organizers, and guides. Their new mission was to bring order and dignity to a people ravaged by the storms of history, to defend the weak where the law had failed, to become, once again, the soldiers of a dream that would not die. In the shifting sands of independence and exile, Mohan Singh began the next act of his extraordinary journey, from freedom fighter and prisoner to a builder of hope amid the ruins. The battle for justice, he knew, was never truly over. The forms might change, but the cause, the soul of a nation struggling to find itself, remained as urgent as ever. Part 6. The Protector of Punjab. Partition and the Desh Sewak Sena. In the first trembling months after independence, the land of Punjab, once the granary of India and the cradle of ancient civilizations, became a vast corridor of loss. The monsoon of 1947 fell on fields stained with tears. The ink of partition's borders was still wet, but already millions were in flight. Whole villages emptied, trains packed with the dispossessed inching toward a new, uncertain dawn. Into this fevered landscape, Mohan Singh stepped once more to the front lines not of war, but of humanity. For Mohan Singh, the wound of partition was personal and relentless. Badiana, his birthplace, and Sialkot, the city of his childhood, now lay beyond an invisible and implacable border. In one stroke, a line drawn by strangers had turned ancestral homes into forbidden territory. Mohan, the general who had marshaled men in foreign jungles, was now a refugee himself, torn from the land whose freedom he had once risked everything to claim. He arrived in East Punjab with only his family, his memories, and a will unbroken by defeat. But the suffering of his own displacement was dwarfed by what he saw all around him. Rivers of refugees, Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim alike, poured across the border, fleeing violence, haunted by massacres, searching for kin in the chaos. Trains arrived at Ludhiana and Amritsar, each carriage a testament to survival and loss. Camps mushroomed on the outskirts of every town. Canvas tents, ration lines, stories of horror traded over smoldering fires. In those desperate days, law and order seemed a memory, and the fragile hope of independence was almost drowned out by the roar of vengeance and fear. Yet, even as darkness threatened to swallow the land, Mohan Singh's instincts as a leader, protector, and servant of the people came alive. He had seen war, betrayal, and exile, and had learned, perhaps more than any man of his time, that power must be used in the service of the weak. He understood that true freedom was not simply the absence of foreign rule, but the presence of justice, dignity, and the courage to stand against hatred. On October 21, 1947, in the stately but battered halls of Majithia House in Amritsar, Mohan Singh gathered a group of like-minded veterans, many of them his old comrades from the INA. Together, they founded the Desh Sewak Sena, the Army of the Servants of the Nation. This was no army in the conventional sense. Its purpose was not conquest, but compassion. Not discipline for discipline's sake, but discipline in the defense of the vulnerable. The DSS was to be a bulwark against the tide of violence sweeping Punjab, an instrument not of vengeance, but of rescue and reconciliation. The idea had been born in darker days. In May 1946, even before the full horror of partition was known, Sikh leaders had gathered at Sultanwind, sensing that chaos was coming. There, Mohan Singh had argued for the formation of a disciplined volunteer corps, warning that Punjab's people would need protection not only from old enemies, but from the fires of their own despair. Now, as 1947's wounds gaped wide, his vision became a reality. The DSS was, in many ways, a family of the betrayed and the brave. At its heart were ex-INA officers, men like Colonel Naranjan Singh Gill, Captain Ratan Singh, and Colonel G.S. Dillon, who had followed Mohan through defeat and defiance. Its ranks swelled with Sikh and Hindu youth, women in the Istri Sena, children in the Bal Sena. Their uniforms were simple gray shirts, sturdy turbans worn not as a threat, but as a promise. We will stand between you and the darkness. Their mission was as radical as it was urgent: to protect Muslim caravans heading westward into the uncertainty of Pakistan, and to escort Sikh and Hindu refugees streaming eastward toward India. Mohan Singh demanded of his volunteers the same discipline, courage, and self-sacrifice he had once asked of his soldiers. "We are not here to punish," he told them. "We are here to protect." In a season of revenge, the DSS became a rare force for mercy. The organization's roots ran deep in the community. The DSS's war cries, "Desh Sewak Sena," "Sada Jeev," and "Hamara Desh, Sada Jeev," rang through the camps, mingling with the songs of mothers and the laughter of children who, for the first time in weeks, felt a measure of safety. The movement was not limited to the sword. Mohan Singh and his friends launched Hamara Desh, a newspaper, to spread their message of unity, courage, and healing. The response from the new Indian government was, at first, almost incredulous. Mahatma Gandhi, Sardar Patel, Nehru leaders who had watched the subcontinent teeter on the brink recognized the desperate need for peacekeepers when police and army were stretched thin. Ammunition, training, and official blessings were offered. Brigadier Mohinder Singh Chopra, stationed in Amritsar, became a key ally, ensuring the DSS was not only respected but equipped to do its work. For a brief moment, Mohan Singh found himself once again a general, not of battlefields, but of barricades at train stations, of makeshift kitchens in refugee camps, of midnight convoys moving families through no man's land. Volunteers stood sentinel through the darkest hours, facing mobs and snipers alike, sometimes laying down their lives for strangers who would never know their names. As autumn faded to winter, the fires of partition burned lower, but their ashes continued to settle on Punjab's fields. The DSS adapted, shifting from an emergency force to a permanent presence in the community, delivering food, aiding in resettlement, giving orphans a place in the new world. Mohan Singh saw the movement evolve, less a militia than a moral army, reminding a battered region that unity, compassion, and discipline were the only true answer to violence. Yet, as the months wore on and the government began to reassert control, there were murmurs that the DSS's time had passed. Officials in Delhi worried about an independent force with its own leaders, symbols, and loyalties. Some urged disbandment. But Mohan Singh, ever the strategist, resisted. The DSS would not simply vanish. Its work would change. But its mission to serve, to heal, to defend remained. For Punjab, Mohan Singh had become more than a soldier. He was now a guardian, a symbol of the possibility that even in the face of unthinkable loss, a people could find their way to mercy, order, and hope. As the new nation struggled to stand on its own legs, the lessons of the DSS discipline, courage, and service echoed long after the chaos of partition had faded. Part 7. Radical Paths and Political Storms. The Legacy of the Desh Sewak Sena. As the winter of 1947 receded and the ashes of partition settled across Punjab, the Desh Sewak Sena, DSS, found itself standing in a new, uncertain dawn. What had begun as a force for rescue and order during the darkest days of independence now faced a different question. How to remain relevant in a country aching to move past its wounds but still haunted by their shadows? For Mohan Singh, the answer was never simple retreat. The same discipline and conviction that had built the INA and saved lives during partition now urged him forward into the heart of a political maelstrom that would define the next phase of his life. The DSS, originally conceived as a bulwark against chaos, became the crucible in which new ideas of justice, power, and identity would be tested. The early months after partition were full of contradictions. On one hand, the Indian state, still fragile and under strain, continued to rely on volunteer organizations like the DSS to maintain order and rebuild shattered communities. On the other, the very existence of a well-trained, semi-military force outside direct government control stirred unease in Delhi and Simla. The DSS's commitment to discipline and sacrifice was beyond question. But its autonomy and Mohan Singh's personal magnetism made some leaders nervous. Still, Mohan Singh's reputation gave him a shield few others enjoyed. The people of Punjab, and indeed many across India, saw him as a living symbol of resistance and hope. To them, the DSS was not a threat, but a promise that the sacrifices of freedom and partition would not be forgotten in the rush to build a new state. The DSS became more than an emergency measure. It evolved into a permanent force for relief and social rebuilding, distributing food, clothing, and medicine, organizing orphanages, and maintaining peace in areas where bitterness still festered. Yet, beneath the surface, a different struggle was taking shape. As the state reasserted control, it began to view the DSS less as a partner and more as a rival. Mohan Singh saw it too. His men, veterans of the INA and the DSS, were not content to simply fade away. They had lost homes, families, and futures in the fire of partition. They wanted not just survival, but justice, recognition, and a place in the new India their suffering had helped create. This yearning for justice sometimes spilled over into militancy. The DSS, disciplined and motivated, began to take up causes beyond relief, challenging corrupt officials, confronting criminals, and occasionally clashing with police. Their old war cries now rang through the streets of cities and towns, less as calls to arms and more as a demand that the ideals of the freedom movement be honored in the day-to-day life of the nation. Tensions with the government reached a head in January 1948, after a speech by Sardar Patel was widely perceived by Sikhs as a slight against their symbols of faith, the turban and beard. To Mohan Singh and his followers, this was not a small matter. It was an affront to the dignity and sacrifices of a community that had borne the brunt of partition's violence. Protests erupted in Punjab, and as far away as Bombay and Jodhpur, with DSS men at the forefront, their discipline now channeled into political activism. The simmering conflict turned tragic in May 1948 with the Kangra incident. Captain Bagh Singh, one of Mohan Singh's most loyal followers, led 20 DSS volunteers in a daring, some said reckless attempt to seize the ancient Kangra fort, a symbolic gesture meant to remind the state of the power and grievances of the ex-INA men. The confrontation ended in bloodshed. Bagh Singh and his group were killed by police bullets. The shock waves from the incident ran through Punjab and the refugee camps, fueling anger, grief, and a sense that the new state was betraying those who had suffered most for its birth. Amid this turmoil, the government tried to co-opt the DSS by allotting land and resources, hoping to channel its energies into rebuilding. Mohan Singh, however, was not so easily bought or silenced. He spoke increasingly of a secular socialist order for Punjab, sometimes describing his vision as a secular dictatorship rooted in discipline and selfless service. The DSS, for a time, became the nucleus of the Desh Sowak movement, an organization that played a controversial role not only in Punjab's reconstruction but also in wider national crises, such as the integration of princely states during Operation Polo. But India was changing fast. The government's patience with independent armed forces, however benevolent their aims, was wearing thin. In late 1948, under pressure from both Delhi and his own allies, Mohan Singh made the momentous decision to dissolve the DSS. It was an end, but also a beginning. He immediately founded the Desh Sowak Party, a political platform for the same ideals of justice, recognition for refugees and veterans, and a refusal to let Punjab's sacrifices be forgotten. Through all the storms, political, personal, and existential, Mohan Singh's legend grew. In the refugee camps and the villages, among orphaned children and widowed mothers, he was hailed as a savior, a man whose faith in discipline and sacrifice had not dimmed even when hope was scarce. His fame, for a time, outshone even that of Master Tara Singh, the great Sikh leader, radiating from the camps to the halls of power. Yet, as the era of the DSS closed and the world of party politics beckoned, Mohan Singh stood at another crossroads. No longer a general in uniform, but a man whose next battles would be fought in the turbulent, unpredictable world of democracy. He had carried the hopes of a wounded land through its darkest night. Now he would test whether those hopes could endure in the unforgiving glare of day. Part 8. The politician emerges. Justice, revolution, and the battle for Punjab. If the jungles of Malaya had forged Mohan Singh the rebel, and the violence of partition had revealed Mohan Singh the protector, then the battered roads and crowded halls of post-independence Punjab would test Mohan Singh the politician. The dissolution of the Desh Sowak Sena was not a retreat, but a metamorphosis. The cause remained, the cry for justice, dignity, and the recognition of sacrifice. Now it would be carried not by battalions in gray uniforms, but through ballots, speeches, and the labyrinth of democratic power. Mohan Singh did not hesitate. He launched the Desh Sowak Party, a vehicle for his ideals and the pent-up demands of thousands who had survived partition's fires. The party's character was unmistakable. Socialist in its rhetoric, authoritarian in its discipline, restless in its desire for change. Its ranks swelled with former INA men, DSS volunteers, and the young, angry refugees who found in Singh not just a leader, but the living echo of their own trauma and hope. Yet, politics in newly independent India was not a soldier's game. Here, power shifted on alliances, not on loyalty. Battles were fought with pamphlets and oratory, not rifles. For every street where Mohan Singh's legend inspired reverence, there was a backroom where older, savvier players plotted. The Desh-Sowak party was a force, but it was also a lightning rod, one whose energy could spark justice or just as easily ignite unrest. The Kotwal murder case in Malakotla would crystallize this paradox. In 1948, when word spread that the town's Kotwal, a senior police official, had raped a young Muslim girl soon to be married, the news exploded like wildfire. Rage swept through the streets. Mohan Singh, moved by the cries for justice and the impotence of official channels, mobilized his followers. In a whirlwind of protest, the Kotwal was dragged into the street and beaten to death, a grim public reckoning that sent shockwaves far beyond the small town. For Mohan Singh's supporters, this was righteous vengeance, the hand of the people correcting the failings of the state. For his critics and for the authorities in Delhi and Chandigarh, it was a dangerous precedent, a challenge to the fragile order of the new republic. In the bloody aftermath, as police cracked down, Singh did not abandon his followers. He summoned his old ally, lawyer Tilak Raj Basin, who fought a dogged campaign until all those arrested in the chaos were released. Incidents like these solidified Mohan Singh's legend as a man of action and unyielding principle, but they also revealed the limits of radical politics in a country eager for stability. Singh saw this himself. The fire that had sustained the DSS and the Desh-Sowak party could not burn forever without consuming its own children. By the early 1950s, even as his speeches still stirred crowds, Mohan Singh knew that lasting change would require a new kind of alliance. In 1950, he made his next bold move, merging his party with the All India Forward Bloc, once led by the martyred Subhas Chandra Bose. The Forward Bloc was a coalition of the disaffected socialists, nationalists, radicals, all united by a conviction that the promises of independence had not yet been kept. But in the ever-shifting sands of Indian politics, even this proved temporary. Later that year, the bloc merged with the Indian National Congress, the very party that, years earlier, had seemed to Mohan Singh both adversary and distant hope. Mohan Singh's entry into the Congress did not diminish his outspokenness. He joined the Punjab Congress Committee, serving on its executive and election committees, and, in 1966, took charge as the treasurer of the Punjab Congress. From this post, he wielded influence not with the blunt force of command, but with the subtle power of negotiation and resourcefulness, directing funds to relief efforts, championing the cause of refugees and ex-soldiers, and ensuring that the INA's story was not erased from the narrative of Indian freedom. The call for justice for INA veterans became his lifelong crusade. For Mohan Singh, it was an open wound. The men who had marched and bled with him in the jungles of Burma and Malaya were too often dismissed as traitors or, worse, forgotten entirely. In Parliament and public, he fought for their recognition as bona fide freedom fighters, their sacrifices honored in the same breath as those who had marched under Gandhi's spinning wheel or Nehru's flag. But Punjab itself was never far from turbulence. In 1962, as China invaded India's northern borders, the old instincts of the general returned. Mohan Singh raised the Punjab Raksha Dal, a rural defense force staffed by volunteers, mostly refugees and former soldiers. He lobbied the government to build military infrastructure in Punjab, even contracting an American firm to begin work on an air suspension factory visionary plans that, for a brief moment, united the Congress, the Shiromani Akali Dal, and Sikh leaders in common cause. Yet, the central government was wary of the resurgence of any independent militia. Orders came from Delhi to merge the Raksha Dal into the official Home Guard, and plans for the air suspension factory were quietly shelved. Still, Mohan Singh pressed on, running for the Punjab Legislative Assembly in 1967, then rising to the national stage as a member of the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of Parliament, where he was re-elected in April 1972. There, Mohan Singh's voice resounded with the same urgency that had once rallied men to freedom's cause. He fought for the rights of refugees, the poor, and the veterans of forgotten battles. He did not court popularity, he demanded justice. And even as age bent his shoulders, his spirit was as upright as the flag he had carried in the darkest jungles of war. Politics had changed him, as it changes everyone. Yet Mohan Singh never let it own him. He remained, to the end, a soldier's soldier, fiercely loyal to his comrades, uncompromising in his ideals, and restless in the face of suffering and injustice. For the battered, striving people of Punjab, he was the rare leader who had marched with them through every shadow and who, even in the labyrinth of power, did not forget the cost of freedom. Part 9. The Elder Statesman. Legacy, Memory, and the Last Years. The decades slipped by, and with them the heat and urgency of revolution, the wild hope and unhealed wounds of partition. But Mohan Singh, once the fiery youth who defied empires, and later the defiant general who challenged both British and Japanese, did not vanish into the obscurity that often swallows rebels and dreamers. Instead, he wore age with the same unyielding dignity that had marked his every battle, his every exile, and his every return. In the India of the 1960s and 70s, modernity pressed in from all sides. New cities rose from refugee camps, new leaders rose from the ashes of old movements. For many, the story of the struggle for independence was becoming the stuff of textbooks and national holidays. But for Mohan Singh, it was neither past nor nostalgia. It was an unfinished task. Alive in the faces of INA veterans still seeking justice, in the farmers and refugees who remembered what it meant to lose everything, and in the Parliament of Free India, where the old general became, for a time, the conscience of the nation. His presence in the Punjab Legislative Assembly in the Rajya Sabha was not that of a politician content with ritual. When Mohan Singh spoke, his voice carried the gravitas of experience, the pain of the jungle, the grief of partition, the hard-won discipline of the INA and Desh Sowak Sena. He never tired of telling the stories that bureaucrats would rather forget. The hunger marches through Burma, the brotherhood of the lost regiments, the red earth of Punjab that had soaked up so much blood, both colonial and native. Above all, he was tireless in his fight for recognition of the INA's sacrifices. Mohan Singh stood, sometimes alone, in parliament and public forums, demanding that the veterans of the Azad Hind Fauj be honored as freedom fighters, their memory etched alongside those who had followed Gandhi or bled at Jallianwala Bagh. He knew how easily the complexities of the independence struggle could be smoothed into myth, how easily inconvenient courage could be airbrushed from the portraits of the nation's founding. He fought not only for medals and pensions, but for memory itself, for the truth that India's freedom was not handed down, but seized by many hands, from many directions, in the face of impossible odds. Yet his life was not all argument and agitation. There was a quieter side, one that came to the fore in the long afternoons spent with old comrades, in the stories told to grandchildren on winter nights in Jujiana, in the way he welcomed young visitors, students, activists, even adversaries who came to seek advice or simply to be in the presence of a man who had walked through history. His home became a gathering place for those seeking inspiration, a living archive of courage, loss, and possibility. Mohan Singh had learned by now that the cost of victory is seldom borne by victors alone. He reached across old divides, urging reconciliation where once there had only been rivalry between Hindus and Sikhs, between refugees and locals, even between those who had opposed the INA and those who had followed it into exile and war. He warned against the poisons of communal hatred, the dangers of forgetting the lessons of struggle, and the false comfort of easy patriotism. There were disappointments, too, in these later years. Governments changed, and new crises rose. But the recognition Mohan Singh sought for the INA and its martyrs came only slowly, sometimes grudgingly. But even this could not dim the light in his eyes. He had lived to see a country torn in two and put back together again, to see generations rise from the ruins of partition and claim the future for themselves. He had seen enemies become neighbors, children born in exile grow up to build new cities and new dreams. In the final years, as his hair grew thin and white and his gait slowed, he remained a fixture of public life, a symbol not only for Punjab, but for India as a whole. When he traveled, he was greeted with the affection of a father figure. When he spoke, it was with the authority of lived history. On December 26, 1989, just days before his 81st birthday, Mohan Singh died quietly, surrounded by family and friends. His passing was marked not only by political leaders and aging comrades, but by the ordinary people whose lives he had touched, the refugees he had sheltered, the orphans he had saved, the young soldiers he had inspired to dream of something greater than themselves. The tributes flowed not from habit, but from genuine memory and gratitude. Mohan Singh's funeral was attended by men and women of every faith, every political stripe, every generation, each one remembering, in their own way, the debt owed to a man who had fought for more than victory, who had fought for the soul of his country. Today, the legacy of Mohan Singh lives on not only in books or statues, but in the quiet, enduring ways a nation remembers its best. In the faces of INA veterans who stand tall in parades, in the families rebuilt from the trauma of partition, in the villages of Punjab that rose from ashes, his story endures a testimony to courage, resilience, and the unbreakable thread of hope. For India, Mohan Singh remains more than a chapter in history. He is a living symbol of what it means to be both wounded and whole, to be both servant and leader, to carry the burdens of a people through darkness and into the uncertain, ever-renewing dawn of freedom.